Paris, December 1975. A man walks into the OPEC headquarters in Vienna, carrying a submachine gun. In only a few moments, 11 hostages lie dead. Dozens more are trapped under his control, and oil ministers from several countries are being pushed toward a plane set to fly to Algeria. The man directing all of this calls himself Carlos. Later, the world will know him as the Jackal, a figure who becomes the most hunted terrorist of the 20th century, a hired gun who worked for whoever paid and left casualties across 3 continents. What almost no one understood at the time was that Israeli intelligence had eyes on him from the moment he fired his first shot. Mossad followed him for close to 2 decades. They tracked his movements through the Cold War maze of Europe, through hidden rooms in the Middle East, and even inside the Soviet networks that offered him protection. Their hunt turned into a long, quiet war of patience, a match where each decision carried a real chance of getting someone killed. And in the end, the finishing blow did not come from a firefight. It came from the same system that had helped shape him, a system that eventually turned on him. To grasp who Carlos the Jackal became, you have to look at the world he came from. He was born Ilich Ramirez Sanchez on October 12, 1949, in Caracas, Venezuela. His father, José Alagrazia Ramirez Navas, a committed communist and practicing lawyer, gave him the name of Vladimir Ilich Lenin. José raised his 3 sons, Ilich, Lenin, and Vladimir, to believe capitalism was an enemy and that revolution was not just an idea, but a duty. The family lived well for the place and the time, yet José made sure his children never forgot that their comfort rested on inequality. Their home was filled with Soviet books, images of Lenin and Stalin, and constant talk about class struggle. By his teenage years, Ilich could quote long stretches of Das Kapital and argue theory with the confidence of someone far older. In 1966, when Ilich was 17, his father sent him to Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow. The school existed to train foreign students in communist ideology and covert action. They gathered young people from Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East and prepared them to return home as loyal agents of Soviet influence. They studied politics, sabotage, propaganda, and guerrilla tactics. Ilich fit easily into this world. He became fluent in Russian, took courses in engineering and political science, and started learning how to use weapons and fight at close range. Still, his instructors saw problems. They noted his lack of discipline and his tendency to act superior. They wrote that he cared more about women and Western music than about the strict demands of revolutionary work. In 1970, the school expelled him for poor grades and repeated rule violations. The stated reason was simple. He did not show the seriousness expected of someone preparing for the revolutionary cause. Even the Soviets, who had shaped more operatives than almost anyone, sensed something unstable in the young Venezuelan and kept their distance. They saw a temperament they could not steer, a mix of raw nerve and impulsiveness that made him more trouble than asset. The rejection stung him, but he refused to slow down. He moved on to Beirut, where the Palestinian struggle had become a magnet for radicals arriving from every direction. By that year, Lebanon lived in a strange balance, daily life on the surface and beneath it a maze of factions preparing for the next fight. The PLO operated in the open from its refugee camps, running training sites where volunteers learned to handle weapons, study ideology, and prepare for missions outside the region. Ilich gravitated to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, a Marxist-Leninist group under George Habash. The faction dismissed negotiations and relied on armed operations and global attacks to force attention. The PFLP had introduced aircraft hijackings into political conflict, seizing planes to bargain for prisoners and push the Palestinian issue onto front pages.
In Jordan and Lebanon, Illich went through their training programs, practicing explosives, targeted killings, surveillance, and the technical routines that would follow him for the rest of his life. His trainers noticed that he handled weapons with ease and showed a kind of fearlessness that bordered on disregard for consequences. They also saw how thin his ideology was. He chased the thrill more than the purpose, drawn to danger and status instead of the long, slow organizing work that movements depended on. By the year 1973, he had taken the operational name Carlos and stepped into the world of freelance militancy. He offered his skills to whoever paid his price. Palestinian commanders used him, as did Libyan intelligence, East German Stasi officers, and wealthy figures who wanted to unsettle Western governments without dirtying their own hands. He wrapped himself in revolutionary slogans while living in upscale hotels, eating expensive meals, and cultivating the image of a roaming insurgent for hire. Mossad first noticed him late that year after intelligence intercepts tied him to a failed rocket strike on an El Al flight at Orly Airport in Paris. The attempt was sloppy. Two militants launched Soviet Strela missiles at a Boeing 707 as it climbed from the runway, yet both shots veered off target. French police caught the pair, and under questioning, they mentioned a Venezuelan organizer called Carlos. At that moment, the name carried no weight. Investigators logged it, filed it away, and moved on, treating it as just one among many minor references buried in reports on Palestinian operations.
But within roughly 2 years, that name would sit at the center of nearly every morning briefing in Tel Aviv. The shift came after the first large-scale mission that pushed Carlos to the top of Mossad's list. On December 21, 1975, he led a group of 6, 2 Germans from the Baunhof Circle and 4 Arab fighters, into the OPEC headquarters in Vienna during a ministers' meeting. The plan was bold and carefully timed. Posing as security staff, the team carried weapons packed in sports bags and moved through the building without raising suspicion. Once inside the conference area, they pulled out their rifles and opened fire. 3 people were killed almost immediately: an Austrian policeman, an Iraqi bodyguard, and a Libyan economist. The attack set off chaos and marked the moment when Carlos stopped being a footnote and became a global priority. They seized roughly 60 hostages, among them 11 oil ministers from OPEC member states. Carlos ran the whole thing himself, walking through the building with a calm, almost staged confidence. He gave orders, set the tempo, and made quick tactical calls that kept everyone off balance. He pushed Austrian officials to bring a bus to the airport, then pressed for a DC-9 aircraft already fueled and ready to leave. The hostages were put on board, and the plane lifted off first toward Algiers, then to Tripoli, and later returned to Algiers. There, Carlos pushed through a deal that let him and his team depart safely, while an unspoken ransom, believed to be in the tens of millions of dollars, changed hands. For Palestinian militancy, the whole event became a loud victory. For Western security forces, it was a sharp embarrassment. In a single day, Carlos turned into an international figure. Newspapers everywhere printed his face, framing him as a symbol of a new and violent political era. Mossad's review of the OPEC attack brought out a key point. Carlos was not just another fighter carrying out someone else's plans. He had his own operational mind, one able to direct cross-border teams and run complicated missions while under heavy strain. Intercepts recorded during the raid caught him shifting between Spanish, French, Arabic, and English, adjusting to every situation without missing a beat. He read people well, using fear, tension, and public drama to amplify the political message. Israeli analysts judged that he marked the start of a different type of terrorist. He was educated, fluent in several languages, practiced in logistics, and not tied down to any single creed or group. He functioned like a freelance weapon, available to whoever could meet his price, which made him both hard to predict and extremely dangerous. Israel's senior leadership made a decision. Carlos became a red-page target, approved for immediate elimination. The search for him began in earnest. Finding him through normal intelligence channels turned out to be nearly impossible. He shifted between aliases, changed his appearance often, and rotated through safe houses across Europe and the Middle East. He used forged passports from Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, and several European countries. His network bridged Palestinian organizations, European left-wing militants, Libyan intelligence, and the East German Stasi, which traded him logistics in return for insights on Western agencies. He lived well, booking into high-end hotels, driving expensive cars, and seeing women who never understood who he really was. People who spent time with him in those years said he was engaging, smooth with languages, and completely without guilt. He could talk philosophy late at night and prepare explosives early the next morning with the same steady detachment. Mossad sent out its top surveillance teams to follow him, but Carlos kept slipping away. In 1975, French intelligence received a lead placing him in Paris and stormed an apartment on Rue Tuileries. Carlos was sitting with two PFLP operatives when DST agents smashed through the doorway, turning the quiet meeting into a sudden firefight. The room blew up into noise and panic. Carlos reached for a check-made pistol on instinct and fired fast, cutting down two DST officers and a Lebanese informant. He then forced open a rear window, slipped out, and vanished into a side street without losing a step. He left Paris right after that, moving through a chain of safe houses scattered across Europe, each one arranged to hide him for only a short while before he shifted again. Word of the shooting spread fast. In militant circles, it lifted him to near-myth status, a man who had killed police at close range and walked away untouched. For Mossad analysts, the event confirmed what they had long suspected. Carlos was dangerous not just because of ideology or contacts. He was dangerous because he reacted with violence the second he felt cornered, using force as naturally as other men used words. Israeli teams began assembling a psychological file to get a clearer sense of who he was behind the public image. What they pieced together showed a mix of deep narcissism and real field skill. Carlos wanted attention. He chased notoriety, gave interviews, allowed photographers to frame him as some glamorous revolutionary figure. He shaped his own legend and enjoyed every part of it. But behind that showmanship stood a man who actually understood the job. He planned routes, broke his movements into strict compartments, and kept several escape plans ready at once. He never stayed in one place longer than a few days. He used coded channels, trusted intermediaries, and kept every person at arm's length, including partners who believed they were close to him. Mossad psychologists saw the contradiction as the core of his behavior. His hunger for recognition pushed him into bold moves that exposed him. His suspicion pushed him to shift locations again and again, making him hard to pin down.
The real shift in the hunt came in 1976, when a Mossad source inside the East German Stasi passed on new intelligence. The source said that Carlos was being sheltered by communist governments in Eastern Europe. The Stasi had given him papers, residences, and transport support in return for his willingness to act as a deniable tool, someone who could carry out missions the East Germans wanted done but could never admit to. By then, Carlos had turned himself into a kind of contractor for state-sponsored terrorism, with deals arranged through go-betweens in Damascus and Tripoli. Israeli analysts now saw that he was not some lone operator. He was part of a wider system backed by governments in Libya, Syria, Iraq, and the Soviet Union. Taking him out meant undercutting the system itself. Mossad shifted from the idea of a quick hit to a longer strategy built on pressure and exposure. They aimed to make Carlos a liability to the very states protecting him, to shine light on his actions until those governments had no choice but to step back from him. The plan demanded slow work. It meant collecting solid intelligence, building links with Western security services, and shaping conditions that would isolate him piece by piece. These services had their own motives for wanting Carlos neutralized, which made cooperation easier. The idea was simple: cut him off from his supporters, leave him with fewer places to hide, and only then move in for the final strike. Over the next 10 years, Mossad teams slipped into Carlos's networks and worked piece by piece to unsettle everything he relied on. They persuaded some of his close people to pass information, pushed others into giving up bits of intel without realizing it, and planted false details that slowly poisoned the trust inside his circles. Reporters received carefully chosen leaks about his activities, and that steady drip of exposure turned his public image into a burden he could not shake. At the same time, the Israelis traced the routes his money followed. They learned which banks he used, which intermediaries handled transfers, and then they quietly jammed those channels until he had to look for new ways to pay for even basic operations. By the early 1980s, his ability to run missions had dropped sharply. His name was everywhere, which meant every Western service watched him, not just the Israelis. People who had once backed him began to pull away because staying close brought too much heat. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, who had financed many of his actions, ended support once global pressure made it impossible to keep helping him in the open. Syria's Hafez al-Assad, after years of offering safe ground, started limiting where he could go and whom he could meet. Even the Stasi, which had shielded him for a long time, became uneasy as East Germany tried to build better ties with Western governments. By then, Carlos was mostly on his own.
He drifted through second-tier safe houses, scattered across Hungary, Romania, and Sudan. Each move reminded him that his old reputation no longer carried weight. The world's focus had shifted, and he was becoming a leftover figure from another era. Through all of this, Mossad surveillance did not ease up. Teams followed his phone calls, compared notes with contacts inside foreign services, and kept running logs on anyone connected to him. Every hotel room, every small flight booked under one of his aliases, every unexpected meeting, everything was recorded and sifted for patterns. The Israelis were not in a hurry to remove him outright. They were studying the full layout of his network, picking out weak spots, and waiting for a point when a clean, decisive action might be possible. But that moment never quite arrived. Carlos stayed wary. He rarely stepped into situations where a strike could be carried out without large risk to bystanders or to the operatives themselves. The turning point came in 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed. With it went the political systems that had covered him for nearly 20 years. East Germany disappeared into a unified Germany that had no interest in offering protection to old Soviet-aligned assets. Hungary, Romania, and Czechoslovakia shifted toward democratic governments and pushed for ties with the West. None of them wanted to be linked to an international fugitive anymore. The structure that had held up Carlos's life was coming apart. His allies were gone, his networks leaked information constantly, and the safe houses he once trusted shut their doors. By 1991, he moved to Khartoum, Sudan, one of the last places still willing to host him. Sudan, under Hassan al-Arabi's Islamist government, had become a gathering point for militant groups, from al-Qaeda members to various Palestinian factions. Carlos stayed there under the watch of Sudanese intelligence, but even that protection felt unstable, a temporary arrangement in a world where his options were shrinking fast. Sudan had slipped into deeper isolation because of its record of backing terrorism, and its leaders were under growing pressure to find a way out. They needed a gesture that would show the West they were ready to change. At the same time, French intelligence, which had been following Carlos since the mid-1975 Rue Tullier shooting, opened quiet talks with Sudan about turning him over. France had a straightforward legal case. Carlos had killed 2 DST officers on French territory, and the French had never stopped looking for him. For the Sudanese government, the situation looked like a chance to trade. They wanted relief from sanctions. They wanted better relations with Western states. In return for financial help and formal diplomatic recognition,
They were ready to hand Carlos to France. It was a deal that could shift the country's future.
Through intelligence sharing channels with French and American services, Mossad learned that these talks were underway. Inside Israel, officials argued over how far to push. Some wondered if they should ask Sudan to send Carlos to Israel instead, to make the case that his actions had also touched Israeli interests. But as the discussions went on, most agreed that French custody served the same purpose. If France held him, he would never return to the field. His networks would lose their figurehead, and his ability to organize attacks would vanish. The symbolic moment of an Israeli capture mattered less than the guarantee that France would convict him and keep him locked up. On August 14, 1994, Sudanese intelligence officers set their plan in motion. They coaxed Carlos to a private clinic in Khartoum with a simple story. He could receive treatment for the chronic testicular pain he had endured for years. He believed the Sudanese would handle the matter quietly. When he walked in, doctors cooperating with intelligence sedated him without resistance. Once he was unconscious, agents moved quickly. They carried him to a waiting vehicle, drove him straight to Khartoum airport, and placed him aboard a French government aircraft. By the time he opened his eyes, he was on foreign soil, chained and watched by armed guards. The handover was clean, fast, and final, Sudan's down payment for rejoining the international community. His capture rippled through the scattered militant circles he had once influenced. Many had assumed he would evade arrest forever. For Mossad, a moment confirmed a long strategy. They had chosen to weaken him piece by piece. They cut his alliances, pressured his sponsors, disrupted his operations, and waited until he stood alone. They knew some targets are not removed by a single shot. Some require slow, grinding pressure until they collapse. In the end, Carlos reached a point where capture was unavoidable. France tried him for the 1975 Rue Tulier murders and sentenced him to life in prison. In 1997, he faced another trial for directing bombings in France during the 1980s and received a second life sentence. In 2011, he stood before a court again for a 1974 bombing in Paris that killed 2 people, and the result was another life term. Through all of this, he stayed confrontational. He turned each courtroom into a platform, delivering long speeches about imperialism and revolution. He insisted he was not a criminal, but a political prisoner targeted by Western states. His words did not change the outcome. The sentences stood, and the man who once moved freely between countries ended his life's work inside a French prison cell. The world had shifted far beyond the landscape he once knew. The Cold War had ended, the Soviet Union had dissolved, and the fierce ideas that shaped his early choices had faded into something museums might reference. He was never the heroic figure he imagined. He had become a leftover from another age, a hired gun whose fame lingered long after his actions stopped mattering. Mossad's involvement in bringing down Carlos stayed mostly hidden, surfacing only in bits drawn from old files and scattered memoirs released many years later. Israeli officers had played a steady, unseen role, tracing his roots, slipping into his circles, and feeding key details to Western agencies that could finally move on him. They did not pull a trigger or place him in handcuffs, yet they built the slow, tight net that eventually closed around him. That kind of work was not dramatic. It was a grind, a long campaign meant to drain a target's strength, piece by piece. Espionage could operate like erosion, steady and quiet, wearing someone down until they had nowhere left to run. The pursuit of Carlos showed how modern intelligence often functions. Some opponents cannot be beaten in one loud strike. They have to be cut off, their money strained, their allies flipped, their safe paths blocked, until fear and loss push them into mistakes that make capture unavoidable. His fall came not from one mission, but from nearly 2 full decades of coordinated pressure by agencies working across borders,
sharing information, and keeping steady even when results were slow. It proved the need for cooperation, the value of patience, and the truth that real success in this field usually arrives without spectacle, marked only by a door locking behind someone who once seemed unreachable. Carlos the Jackal sits in a French prison now, serving several life sentences with no chance of release. He is in his mid-70s, far removed from the man who once threatened governments, held oil ministers as bargaining chips, and fought his way out of raids with reckless confidence. From time to time, he still gives interviews, still talks about revolution and imperialism, still claims he fought for justice. But history has spoken. He was not the champion he pretended to be. He was a professional of violence who worked for whoever paid, and he coded those choices with ideology to make them look noble. For Mossad, the hunt was not about settling old scores or searching for symbolic justice. It was about removing a danger, stopping someone who had already shown he could strike Israeli targets anywhere he chose. Their success came not from a dramatic hit, but from careful, deliberate pressure that showed that sometimes the strongest tool is not force, but the steady passage of years closing in on a man who once believed he was untouchable.